Good afternoon to all. My name is Sabine Bourdi. I'm the head of unit in DG Environment for mainstreaming and environmental impact assessment. I would like to warmly welcome all of you for this afternoon session, which will be dedicated to the unlocking of the finance for biodiversity. This is a very up-to-date topic. The objective of the session will be to explore solutions for biodiversity financing, with a view, of course, to support the implementation of the new biodiversity strategy that has been adopted in May by the Commission, a very ambitious strategy, with also a view to support the funding of the future binding ecosystem restoration legislation that will be adopted most probably next year. But also, I would say, globally, to see how we can upscale public and private investment for biodiversity. So we will look into smart ways of using and combining EU fund and program under the next MFF, but also the new recovery plan, and in particular the next generation EU instrument and the resilience and recovery facility, and all the tools which will create a leverage to the private sector investment, such as in particular InvestEU, the program that will replace the so-called Juncker plan, and its future 10 billion euro investment initiative, which will be dedicated to natural capital and circular economy. We will look also into technical assistance support, and in particular the one that the LIFE program will provide. So we will, of course, build on the biodiversity strategy commitment to unlock 20 billion per year for nature, including from the next financial perspective, from the member state co-financing, but also from any additional investment leverage, in particular InvestEU. And we will see also how we can maximize synergy with climate finance, including by dedicated a significant portion of the 30% of the next financial perspective and next generation EU for climate to also biodiversity and nature-based solution. So we will have a number of excellent panelists that will take the floor, but I would like first to give the floor to my colleague from DG Budge, who is the head of unit in DG Budge for performance and based budgeting. He will be responsible for tracking this expenditure under the EU budget, so a very important mission, Bernhard. And maybe before you take the floor, a few housekeeping mention for all participants. For those who have not yet had the pleasure to join the Green Week hybrid session, just to remind that all microphones are mute for the participants, so that we can have a smooth running of the intervention of the panelists. Should you have any question or comments, they are mostly welcome. You can use the chat function, and we will come back to a Q&A session at the end of about 15 to 30 minutes, depending how time allows. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I now have the pleasure to pass the floor to Bernhard. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for being here. I have to admit, I already said this before, but it's a bit odd to kind of look at this empty room and speak, but I do hope that there are many of you who are interested in following this afternoon session and this event in general. As was already said, I am going to talk a bit about biodiversity financing from the budget, and I think we all can see the slides, I hope. I want to focus on 4 different points very quickly. So what do we actually do currently? How do we do it? And then have a look at what happened during the last, or current, I should say, MFF period, and what is going to happen or what we plan to happen in the next period. So let's start with the first one. So we are forward-looking on the next MFF. Obviously, you all know it's not yet been adopted. There are three currently in the current MFF. There are three different priorities that we are tracking in detail that are linked to green, climate, obviously, biodiversity, and air quality. I think here the key point is that these are all policies that are mainstreamed into our budgetary policy, and we are trying to basically sum up all the contributions through the different programs to those priorities to come up to the figure. So the 210 billion, that is basically what has been invested into climate between 2014 and 2020. The same is true for biodiversity, 86 billion, and for air quality, 46 billion. I just ask you to keep in mind the number 86 billion for biodiversity. We are going to come back to that in a moment. So just to give you an idea of what we actually do on green priorities in the budgetary cycle. So as you know, the EU budget is a bit special because we have two budgetary cycles. We have an annual cycle, so we have an annual budget that is actually working on an annual basis. And we have what is called the Multiannual Financial Framework, which is currently a 7-year period, which sets a lot of the framework conditions that we are actually following and limits, I would say, quite significantly the freedom that we have on an annual basis. We still have quite a lot of flexibility, but compared to annual budgets in a national context, I think we have also quite a lot more constraints. I think if you look at the top right of the slide, you see that in a sense when we prepare an MFF, the policy design is obviously the first stage where already ideas and concepts of the green, including biodiversity, are very important. So the first part is the famous do no harm principle, or do no significant harm principle as the taxonomy phrases it, which basically is designed to ensure that all our budgetary interventions, whatever they contribute to positively, do not harm any other priorities. So I think that is basically the idea. Do no harm is easier to pronounce, but obviously it needs to be do no significant harm simply because whatever human beings do will cause some harm to somebody, and we need to come to terms with this. So I think we simply need to ensure that we do not go beyond a certain level that we set ourselves. This design is then kind of featured in a number of documents that we use on the budget. So how do we invest? What kind of conditions put we around our investments? How do we track and ensure? How do we audit? All these parts are part of the policy design that then flows into the annual budget cycle. So then we are at the lower right. Here, as I said, we are going then to implement according to the rules that the co-legislators have set for us on the different programs. And we are tracking ex post, both actually ex ante and ex post. So ex ante, the expected contribution from the budget, and ex post, the actual contribution from the budget. And we are reporting this on the lower left in the program statements, which is a document that we publish on an annual basis in the context of the draft budget, where we actually explain also how our different programs contribute to all kinds of different priorities. And the green priorities obviously feature very highly, particularly in the horizontal priorities. We then move to the top left, where we basically enter the multi-annual stage again, because at the end, actually most often also in the middle of the programs, but certainly after the end of the programs, we do evaluations on these sectoral programs. We look at also how the green priorities, amongst many others, are taken into account before we actually make a proposal for the next one. So let's apologize, I realize that probably the numbers are a bit small, but how much did we spend in the current MFF? You see that basically we have been spending pretty constantly since 2017, around 8.2, 8.3%. Of our budget on biodiversity expenditure. There was a starting point that was a bit low. I think that had mainly to do with questions in the cohesion part of the budget, and particularly in the second pillar of the agricultural program, which is a shared management program focused on longer term projects. So I think there was simply a starting point that was a bit difficult to get off the ground at the beginning of the MFF. But basically we have stabilized over time. And one takeaway from the slide is that obviously this is not surprising, but the agricultural policy obviously has a key role in our spending. This is just 3 achievements, and I hope that you're actually going to get the slides because I'm not going to talk you in any detail through these. If you go into the program statements, you will find that we have provided for each of our policies relevant and interesting examples of how these policies, if they contribute to, for example, biodiversity, we have included interesting examples of what we have actually achieved on the ground. So obviously this is not systematic, these are just anecdotal evidence, but it's very important to understand that actually what the EU budget is doing has very concrete effects on the ground. So for example, here we have shown a live program which is protecting green turtles in the Mediterranean. And I think there are many such programs that either look at habitats more generally or a specific species, where basically the budget is trying to help and assist in protecting biodiversity and reversing biodiversity loss. And again, I do apologize for the smallness of the figures, but unfortunately here it's more structural because it's difficult to actually put all these figures on one slide, but it's important. So what we're doing here is we are comparing the contributions from the current programs and the contributions from the next programs as they are expected on the basis of rather conservative assumptions. I'm saying conservative assumptions because what we're basically doing here is if we were simply going to continue spending in the same way as we were spending before, there are some changes in the envelopes of our programs, there are some changes in the priorities of our programs. These we take into account, but what we don't take into account is the fundamental fact that the Commission has obviously changed and green has taken a much higher priority. So this is in a sense the baseline from which we then start to improve. So what you see here on the right-hand column are the contributions from this MFF, so from the planned MFF, assuming that it's going to be adopted in the form that it's supposed to be adopted. But we obviously have to kind of see what comes out of it, so there might be changes. But the idea is that in the right-hand column, on the basis of the plans that the Commission has put forward and the UCO conclusions in July, we've simply applied the past history to the future. And as you can see, in a sense, the financing over the MFF is roughly stable. If we include co-financing and leverage, it will be slightly higher, and I think this is already the first indication of what we are trying to do different in the next period. So this slide is in a sense the key slide, even though it is very empty. What has changed since we made actually our first MFF proposal is that the Commission has adopted the Green Deal and the Biodiversity Strategy. This has already been mentioned, and I think it's absolutely crucial that to understand that this also had very significant impact on the way that the budget has been conceived and is going to look at biodiversity. So the first one is on the left, so Natural Capital Investment Initiative under InvestEU. This is basically a 10 billion program, a window as we call it under InvestEU, which is available for investment in natural capital. It's new, particularly in this scale. There's nothing comparable in the current MFF, and obviously this is based on leverage, so this is part of the number that you saw on the previous slide. But there are also other areas that are incredibly important. So you might know that in Horizon, the Horizon Europe, which is the follow-up program from Horizon 2020, the Commission has set thematic priorities. And in a sense, we've set 5 thematic priorities, which obviously are hopefully going to be endorsed by the co-legislators. Of which 4 are highly relevant for biodiversity, focusing on oceans, on natural capital, on climate, on safe food. So there is a lot of focus also in these missions, these thematic priorities under Horizon. The Commission has published the Farm to Fork strategy, which is another key area because what is bad for humans is often also bad for biodiversity. So use of pesticides, use of similar questions is very important. Last point on the right, eco schemes in the CAP. There has been a significant, given that it's difficult to green the CAP Pillar 1 direct support. The Commission has introduced the concept of eco-schemes, and you might have seen this morning there was news that the Council has reached an agreement where actually some significant ring fencing of money under eco-schemes has been agreed. This is the Council position. It's a first step, but I think it's highly relevant for what we're talking about here today. I want to finish on Next Generation EU, and I'm aware that I only have probably 15 seconds left, but I would like to simply say here that Next Generation EU is a huge program. It's roughly, well, more or less 3/4 of the size of the whole MFF, and it's going to be spent over a very short time. And a lot of it will be dedicated to climate and biodiversity financing. So I leave it here. We can obviously discuss this further in the questions and answers. And thank you very much again for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Bernhard, we thank you very much. I think it was a very comprehensive presentation and very welcome to introduce also the follow-up, the panelists that will come afterwards. I retain from your presentation that even with a conservative, I would say, approach, we would keep the same level of expenditure as a first. And as we have on the top of this, the Next Generation EU, we should have more for biodiversity. This is, of course, eligible under, in particular, the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So this is very encouraging for future prospects. Thanks a lot, Bernhard. Thanks a lot. And I have the pleasure now to introduce Barbara Herrero. Barbara is the EU Nature Policy Officer in BirdLife, Europe and Central Asia. Barbara, can you share with us the NGO's perspective on biodiversity finance, including the needs, the funding needs, of course, that you have assessed, and what would you see as priorities under the next financial perspective and recovery plan that have just been explained by Bernhard? Please, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Thank you very much for having me here. It's quite exciting to get out of the house. So indeed, I'm Nature Policy Officer in BirdLife Europe and Central Asia. How I'm going to frame my presentation is that, especially in view of what's been happening in the last few days, in particular last night in the Parliament, biodiversity is the quintessential public good. What does that mean? It means that everybody benefits from it, everybody gains from its well-being, but it's not really noticed. It gives us clean water. Biodiversity makes nutrients for our food. It makes it captures carbon, and it goes from the tiniest bacteria to the bee, to the blue whale, but we don't see that its value. And because it's a public good, it needs public finance. And indeed, the MFF, there is some budget to it, but I hope that in those 86 billion, you're actually checking that the money that DG Agri says goes to biodiversity actually benefits biodiversity, and it's not like with climate change that it's just a tick box exercise where the whole of CAP is put as climate useful finance. We all know it's not. So we have the money. The money is there. We spend it. We spend it in many things that are actually damaging biodiversity. We are spending hundreds of billions of euros in harmful subsidies that are destroying biodiversity. And things like the cap, which yesterday was voted to not only keep doing all the bad things that we know it's doing, destroying nature, but it's been voted to do more. So I hope that the Commission will have the guts to go back to the drawing board and do what they have planned to do all along with this Green Deal, and change how we are spending that money. Because what we need is a change in the politics. I mean, yesterday, hundreds of people that were voted in on promises of change, on promises of being more green, on promises of taking care of our environment, all voted to destroy it, basically. What we have assessed from BirdLife that is needed to preserve nature, a couple of years ago, we figured that we would need about 20 billion per year to conserve biodiversity. The vast majority of it coming from the CAP, a little bit coming from the EMFF. The CAP is not the only harmful subsidy out there. And there are plenty of things that we can do, that we know that we can do to change the way we are spending this money. So Bernhard is right in saying that Next Generation EU is a huge opportunity to change how things are being done. And I'm really hoping that the member states take the advice that the Commission is giving in their guidance documents, in their templates on how to spend this money, because there is the ideas of how you can spend money to create jobs through nature restoration, through nature conservation. I mean, it's rather simple things, or simple is probably not the right word, but things where policymakers shouldn't doubt. I mean, you can ditch a peatland, for instance, that can bring you clean water, it can mitigate floods, it can bring tourism, it can bring jobs directly to the ditch, the peatland, and it can bring back the butterflies, the frogs, the curlews, the plants, store carbon. Who on earth wouldn't want to spend the money in things that can benefit everyone? So I have plenty more ideas I can share, but I'll talk about them later if there's time.
Barbara, thank you very much for sharing your views and recalling that nature and biodiversity are a public good, need public financing. I would even add they need also private financing, in the sense that if you look into the recent or the latest report from the World Economic Forum, you will see that among the highest risk for economy is biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation. So if they identify this as a high risk, they should also support the mitigating and the restoring part of it. That sometimes they contribute to destroy, by the way. So just a parenthesis, but thank you very much for this. And I would like now to pass the floor to the colleague of EIB, Eva Mayerhofer, who is going to tell us more about the EU Natural Capital Financing Facility. This facility has been implemented by EIB. I think, Eva, we can certainly learn some lesson for the next step, in particular under InvestEU, the upcoming InvestEU. Please, Eva, I hope you are connected. Eva is going to make a presentation in a remote facility. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabine. And a bit of a bleak picture that was presented there, but I think a lot of points that were indeed very true. And I think the financing of biodiversity has two dimensions. One is what I call the positive agendas, is providing finance to biodiversity-related projects, and the other one is to ensure that we protect biodiversity through integrating biodiversity externalities into and integrating risks to biodiversity into our decision-making process. But going back, what I'm supposed to be talking about and the lessons learned out of the Natural Capital Financing Facility, and this is more looking at the positive agenda and really financing quote-unquote green. One of the key challenges with nature projects in general is that they're often small scale, localized, and biodiversity projects frequently involve very little cash flow. As we heard before, they are often a public good, and it makes it difficult to attract private sector financing. Also, I think it was said by the colleague from DG Budget, is that the true value is not reflected in the economic transactions. So even where projects generate some cash flow, the financial mobilization of private finance, the returns are often very low and below market return hurdles. So what can we do to be able to generate the volume and necessary for an institution such as the EIB or any other financial institution to be interested in financing such projects? And it is really through intermediaries and aggregators. And what we mean by aggregators is pooling schemes of revenue. It's taking a landscape approach as well as mainstreaming nature into our normal operations. And this is very important. Our experience has been that nature-related investments are typically embedded inside larger investment programs. So with multiple objectives within regulated investment programs and that have broader business models, portfolios, or even supply chains. So the market will need more regulated investments and revenue streams in order to reach that potential, as well as higher sustainability standards and risk awareness. And this is, I think, a point that was made by the previous speaker, is these standards are not really mainstreamed within the financial sector, for example, in which I work. So by comparison, if you take the water sector or other environmental sectors with stronger regulation drive, they actually do drive a significant investment need, revenues, and financing structures. And one of the fears that I still have is going into the next MFF and in terms of InvestEU, although there is a target for environmental sustainability, there will be cherry picking. And in this, I mean, is that we will be going for the investments that are well regulated, that drive that significant investment needs, and it is easier to structure. It is difficult to structure financing for biodiversity projects. One area that is very difficult to deal with is land acquisition. And we see that in the EU, but also especially outside of the EU, where you have also the complication of rights to land. And you also have the issues of who owns the land. And you need to take this all into consideration. Also, buying land leads to land speculation, which then becomes also detrimental to the underlying objective of the financing that you're trying to promote here. We've been using different blended finance schemes as well as grants to target these types of projects. We found that grants and technical assistance provide significant value, and there is a demand for technical assistance at all stages of the project development, from the upstream to the hands-on on detailed design monitoring of such projects. And as the climate bank, the EIB has set itself a target of supporting investments in climate action and environmental sustainability of 1 trillion in this critical decade of 21 to 2030. And so therefore, it will have to gradually increase its contribution in terms of financing to biodiversity and ecosystem protection and restoration. The challenge, nevertheless, remains for us is how do we measure these projects? How do we measure their impacts? The metrics are not a given. How do we then also track them and report on them? And these are key elements in order for us as a financial institutions and other our peer institutions in order to mobilize these resources at scale for biodiversity. We need the metrics, we need the robust tracking methodologies, and we need reporting standards. That way we will be able to have a leverage over our clients to start really investing in biodiversity, but also in terms of protecting biodiversity through integrating environmental or biodiversity related risks into their decision-making process.
Eva, many thanks for this assessment on the lesson learned that EIB has gathered following the implementation of the NCFF. I think it's very valuable, very important to have also the viewpoint of a bank, in the sense that you are confronted with projects that are not revenue generating most of the time. You need to have an aggregated demand. And I think all the very good advice that you have provided will be definitely very interesting to build future green project and to green traditional project, as you have mentioned. Thanks a lot. It is now my pleasure to welcome Giorgio Caron-Casoni. I understand that, Giorgio, that you are connected from Luxembourg. I hope you can hear us. Giorgio is in the European Commission working in DG ECFIN. He is in charge of InvestEU program. He will tell us more about InvestEU, but also the facility in terms of assistance that can be also supported through the advisory hub, future advisory hub of InvestEU. Giorgio, I hope you can hear us. Please, the floor is yours. Be very welcome.
Thanks a lot. Thanks very much for having invited me. Hope you can hear me. So I continue assuming that you will hear me. So indeed, I'm responsible for the InvestEU program, a program that has been both by Eva and Bernhard beforehand. And if you can see in the next slide, the InvestEU is
I'm afraid, Giorgio, we can't hear you properly. I don't know. Maybe you can turn off your video.
One of the key supporting what is targeted by InvestEU is actually, as you can see, the risk-return logic. Because
I'm
we
sorry,
felt
Giorgio, to
many
interrupt. I don't know
for
if you
example,
can hear
more
me.
green or more environmental friendly projects very often perceived as being too risky to be invested, and in order to promote private investors, notably through the Yes.
Giorgio, I think we have a small technical problem to hear you properly. Would you be so kind to turn off your video so that maybe we will better hear your voice? Thanks a lot. Giorgio, can you hear me? I think waiting maybe for resuming the presentation of Giorgio. Giorgio, can you hear us? Can you hear us? We cannot hear Giorgio anymore. Maybe it will come back later on. I would maybe try to pass the floor then immediately to the next speaker, and if we manage, we will come back to Giorgio afterward. The next speaker is Evelyn Underwood from the Institute for Europe and on Environment Policy. Evelyn will be detailing for us the provision under common agricultural policy and its contribution to nature and biodiversity finance. I hope, Evelyn, you can hear me properly. Since the CAP is the main source of biodiversity financing, as it was mentioned by Bernhard earlier, what will be the main challenges, but also opportunities to boost biodiversity finance under the next financial perspective? How CAP can effectively support the agricultural target of the EU Biodiversity Strategy and the Farm to Fork strategy that was recalled by Bernhard? And I would say echoing also what Barbara Herrero mentioned to us earlier. Please, Evelyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandra, for this opportunity. And I will be very brief so that we can save a bit of time and be able to respond to all your questions, as I'm sure you're adding to the chat right now. So to start, let's look at whether the CAP is unlocking funding for biodiversity now. Member states are reporting that the CAP Rural Development Fund makes up around 2/3 of the EU funding going to Natura 2000 and species protection. And Member states' reports of the CAP spending show that overall a bit less than 15% of agricultural land is under management contracts supporting biodiversity and landscapes. I think as the EU State of Nature report shows, as I'm sure you've all heard about, this was not enough funding, and agriculture is one of the biggest issues. You can see the graphs there of the dramatic declines in biodiversity that we're seeing directly associated with agriculture. Next slide, please. So how does the new CAP relate to the Natura 2000 objectives and biodiversity more widely? The general environmental objective of the new CAP framework states that the CAP must contribute to the environmental objectives of EU legislation, and this includes the Habitats and the Birds directives, which remain the legal basis for biodiversity protection in the EU. The CAP strategic plan must therefore take account of Natura 2000 funding needs and the programming of the biodiversity objective, as laid out in the Member States' prioritised action framework for Natura 2000, and especially for their semi-natural grasslands and other agro-ecosystems, including the species on croplands. The key to maximising the biodiversity benefits of the CAP will be to ensure that the funds are as closely aligned as possible to each Member State's prioritised action framework, and of course that the path is good to start with. New is that the programming of the CAP objective must cover both pillars. So the strategic plans have to consider the relevance of Pillar 1 payments to Natura 2000, including the eco-schemes. Next slide. I think I'll skip this slide. I'm sure you're all familiar with the targets in the new Farm to Fork and Green Deal. Just to point out that there's the target for the at least 10% of agricultural area under high diversity landscape features, but also the targets related to the Annex 1 habitats. Next slide. So what are the lessons that have been learned from the current CAP? The most important message from the recent DG Agri evaluation of the CAP measures on biodiversity was that CAP support for biodiversity must be focused on measures that maintain and restore semi-natural habitats and semi-natural features on farmland to maximise the benefits. It's essential that the strategic plans use the most effective measures and target them, and that's primarily as indicated in the prioritised action frameworks. But also, of course, looking beyond Natura 2000, the green infrastructure in our agricultural areas. Now, tailored agri-environment schemes are the most effective measures for really getting a win for biodiversity and agricultural land. Targeting also increases effectiveness and overall efficiency, and targeting to Natura 2000 sites and the requirements in the paths is now essential to tackle the biodiversity crisis. We really need to get the most impact out of the money that's spent. However, the beneficial impacts of agri-environment schemes are very often constrained by their limited scale, and this includes low budgets and low farmer uptake. So it's going to be essential for the strategic plans to increase uptake through support, advice, and making sure the payments are sufficient. The new CAP also needs to really support innovation and new approaches. As we've heard in previous sessions, it's as much also about inspiring farmers and explaining to them, giving them a real ownership of why these things really matter to stimulate engagement and motivation. And providing the support mechanisms that enable farmers to make a living from the products that they produce. The new CAP's flexibility gives member states many possibilities to tailor measures and funding to the needs of biodiversity. However, a lesson from the current CAP period is that flexibility and a lack of specific objectives often leads to a maintenance of the status quo because there's not enough pressure to change, and greening is an example of this. If the CAP's going to deliver better for biodiversity, it will need strong tracking of biodiversity spending and strong conditionality. And the eco schemes will also need to deliver meaningful and widespread outcomes for biodiversity. I'll leave it there, and I look forward to explaining more in the questions.
Evelyn, thank you very much. I think this is very well complementing the previous presentation. I'm very sorry that I cannot get back to Giorgio because time is running. But thank you very much. I think it's very important to keep in mind the need for this coherent approach between the two pillars that should be provided by the new strategic planning, and also the need that when we have reinforced money like future targeting, it's really important that the right measures are being used. Thanks a lot again for this, Evelyn. I would like maybe to start replying to some of the questions. A first question maybe for Eva. I hope, Eva, you can still listen to us. A question on the financing and the private financing support. Financing should also come from private sector, not only from public sector. We live in the same planet. Do you agree, Eva? Could you tell us more and reply to this question? Very important one.
Yes, I do agree. I mean, what we need to do is lever all different actors. So whether it is rating agencies, whether it's the regulator, whether it's the private sector, businesses, so we all need to come together and contribute to restoration, to biodiversity financing. The way that the private sector will need to start doing that and to understand what their impact is they need to start integrating biodiversity risks in their decision-making process. I mean, we are lucky to have had the World Economic Forum report that has highlighted the financial materiality of biodiversity risk. And I think that is a game changer in the whole discussion and in the biodiversity financing space. However, we will need to start being a little more creative in what I call, again, the positive agenda, in getting private sector to finance. And it is looking at really wider programs and seeing how they can contribute in current infrastructure projects, for example, finance biodiversity restoration. So we still think that pure biodiversity projects are going to still remain very small, but if we want to have the larger impacts, we need to look at forestry sector, the agricultural sector, the fisheries sector, and see how we can find those synergies, and the synergies also with circular economy, climate, and the industrial sector.
Thank you very much, Eva, for this very comprehensive answer. I think it's very important indeed that nature is becoming part of the private sector accountability. And I would like also to ask Barbara Herrero her viewpoint on this question. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I think private financing will have a role to play. But we need the enabling environment. What does the enabling environment mean? It means that we need the law to be enforced. There is regulation. It was mentioned a few times, the Birds and Habitats Directives. Not only that, the Water Framework Directive, legislation, marine legislation at European level that needs to be properly enforced. And the Commission and Member States have to make sure that it's enforced, because if not, if people can keep making profit from destroying nature, that's what's going to happen. Nobody is going to invest in protecting nature because the returns, as we heard, are very little. There's little cash flow. It's difficult to attract the private sector. Once it's impossible to make a profit from plowing up a Natura 2000 site, then we will start being able to see private investment flow into restoration, into conservation, into actual management, into better things for society, into a forest that is allowed to grow old next to a new urban development, a rewilded river that brings biodiversity, brings flood defenses to that same new urban space, for example. But we need that regulatory environment, and we need to enforce the law.
Thank you, Barbara. You are totally right. And I think also we have to help investors to see where the potential investment is green or not green. And this is also the role of taxonomy regulation and upcoming delegated act. And we of course, put a lot of effort in this, because it will also allow the implementation of the do no significant harm principle that Bernhard has mentioned earlier. Thank you very much. Another question, a very interesting one on CAP. Also CAP, and this is maybe more for Evelyn, if you can still hear us, Evelyn. CAP is being reformed. A significant amount of subsidies still go to unsustainable farming practices, which harm biodiversity. Is there a way to reallocate subsidies to nature-friendly agriculture? I think this is also very closely linked to what Barbara was saying during her presentation. Please, Evelyn, the floor is yours.
Yes, so I'm assuming this refers mainly to the 60% of the CAP budget that still goes on direct payments under Pillar 1. And of course, it's difficult to point out that to actually prove that direct payments incentivize increase to production, but they're very targeted, they're very skewed towards the farms that have the most intensive production. Eco schemes are going to be a really key factor. So it's very key as to how much of the Pillar 1 budget is ring-fenced to eco schemes and how well member states can really encourage farmers to take these up from the first year. It's going to be really key to really make sure that member states are fully investing as much as they can in providing the farmer advice, the support, the awareness raising, working together with stakeholders who work with farmers who can get engage them in eco schemes, and to make sure that the nature conservation authorities, for example, are lined up to give targeted inputs on what are the key measures for biodiversity that the eco schemes can support, so that they're lined up from the beginning to produce the expected results. The Pillar 2 investments, their member states have been given a lot more flexibility. Some of those detailed rules that are in the current period on what you can and can't fund on irrigation and afforestation and field consolidation and so on, they've fallen away. So there again, it's going to fall back partly on member states and their environmental impact assessment framework. And it's going to also depend a great deal on how much oversight the Commission can manage to keep on what's going on with those investments. I hope that answers the question, as far as we know so far.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. I think indeed it does answer to the question. I have another question for Eva now, if Eva can still listen to us. Very interesting question. What are some of the most important indicators that green investor will look at when investing in new solutions and companies? Could you, in a very short time, answer to this, because we are very close to the end of our workshop? Eva, please, the floor is yours.
Green indicators. Unfortunately, I mean, the green indicators that we have today are related to water quality or related to air quality. We have very few indicators that are related to biodiversity and in terms of also restoration. We are, I think, at the very beginning, and we're trying to develop those indicators. I think is still impacts on human health is always a first indicator that companies will look at, and also water and soil. But in terms of species, for example, the health of species or the conservation status of species, I'm afraid to say that this is much too complex at this level for companies to be looking at. And we will need to find proxies or other types of indicators that can be used easily and could be easily understood by industry and companies or the financial sector alike.
Thank you very much, Eva, and thanks to all participants that have posted very interesting questions and comments on the chat. We cannot answer all of them orally, but we will certainly provide you some at least a first answer in the chat box as much as we can. I would like maybe to come to conclusion of our discussion this afternoon. I think there's been unfortunately not the possibility to present InvestEU and the 10 billion investment initiative on natural capital. I hope this will take place another time, because this is also a very promising tool to, I would say, scale up private investment. And there's a lot of question around this scaling up of private and unlocking the private investment. I think tackling biodiversity loss and restoring ecosystem will require definitely significant public and private investment at national and European level. So we really need to make the most of all relevant EU program and financing instruments under the next multi-financial framework, as well as under the EU and the recovery plans that will come soon. Beyond the central also role played by the common agricultural policy today, it's really important that we continue using cohesion funds and other sources of EU funding for the investment needs under the natural capital and circular economy investment initiative, as well as other financial projects. This is really important that we manage really to reach this 10 billion, and mobilize this 10 billion new initiative that was proposed under the recovery package as well. I think it's also very important to do something about traditional project and investment and try to green them as much as we can through also the use of this funding, through the appropriate implementation of the do no significant harm principle. I don't think we can go more far today because it's already nearly 3 o'clock. So I would like really to thank all participants. I would like to thank all also speakers that have been with us today, including the poor Giorgio that could not manage but was ready really to join. I would like also to warmly thank those who are beyond the stage. It's really strange here to have no public in the room, but we see a lot of technicians at the end of the room. And I would like in particular to thank technicians and also Hélène Perrier and Andrea Bianchini, without whom this workshop probably would not have taken place. So a warm thank to both of them as well. And I wish you a good end of afternoon. Thanks a lot again to all of you.